Welcome back to Propaganda by the Seed Shorts. In today's episode, I'm going to be telling you about some of my favorite informational resources. And it's important to note that I will provide links to most, if not all, of the resources I mention. So you don't have to search too hard or take notes while you're listening. All that stuff is in the show notes. But before we dive into that, let's hear from another podcast on the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
The Anarchist.
Radio
Berlin.
From across the pond.
So it's the Anarchist Radio Berlin.
With audios in English, Spanish and German.
And please,
don't mention the war.
You can find us at channelzeronetwork.com and aradio-berlin.org.
Today I'm going to be telling you about some of my favorite informational resources. And this shorts topic was requested by Paul in Montreal. So if you have something that you would like to hear as a topic on Propaganda by the Seed Shorts, please do send me an email at propagandabytheseed@riseup.net or a DM on Instagram or Blue Sky or whatever other way you want to get a hold of me, message in a bottle, etc. So I think the first and probably most important informational resource are real-life contacts. If you can speak directly with another human that is interested in similar things to you, that's probably your best bet. Not always, but I have found that to be the most useful informational resource. And obviously finding those people is not always easy. So here are some ideas of where you might find other people to kind of share growing information with. Community garden volunteer events are a great way to get involved with community aspects of growing and find like-minded people. Kind of similar to habitat restoration events. You know, you do some work, you pull some invasives, but you probably also meet some cool people along the way. Useful plant societies and permaculture groups are a great place to find people interested in perennials, especially if that is also something you're particularly interested in. Scoping out neighbors' gardens as you drive or bike or walk around, and then ambushing them with questions about their garden whenever you see them out there working. I have a neighbor who has a beautiful home orchard, and we have exchanged varieties and information, and it's a really, really cool thing if you can pull it off. State-level organic associations like MOFGA here in Maine or NOFA in other Northeast states. I think most states have some degree of this. They might have events or networking groups, meetings, etc. that are a great way to plug in. And on a national level, I really like NAFEX, the North American Fruit Explorers, and NNGA, the Northern Nut Growers Association. For tree crops, at least, these are some of the premier groups in this country, and their demographics are skewing really old. There's some new people coming in, but if we want to preserve the infrastructure of these very important groups, it's important that young people join and pay dues to keep these membership organizations running. And it's not expensive. It's like $25 a year. And that gives you access to not only in-person events that can be kind of hard to get to, but they also do monthly Zoom interest group meetings. So if you want to get together with 20 to 50 people on Zoom and talk about mulberries or different types of grafts or whatever, it's a really good forum for it. Both of those groups also have Facebook groups that are public and free to join and are maybe the best thing left on Facebook, in my opinion. Those groups are a great place to get questions answered. If you don't have in-person local contacts, you can just throw out like, what is wrong with my cherry tree, and hopefully get some good information from the crowd. Also a great place to talk about new varieties, stuff like that. If you're hearing this, you probably like podcasts, and so some podcast recommendations. Perennial AF from the Savanna Institute is great. Lots of, deep scientific content, not unlike this podcast. There's also Poor Prole's Almanac, which tends to be a little bit more theory-based, but sometimes also does very similar content to Propaganda by the Seed, where they focus on a single plant. In Defense of Plants is a little bit more academic, and it's one that I don't listen to every episode because some of them just aren't interesting to me, but I've also learned some fascinating stuff. And if you're looking for a place to start in their massive catalog, I would check out the one on the controversy over juglone. That has been very interesting to me. And also the episode on the Ozark chinkapin is really good. And then if you get sucked in, there's hundreds of episodes of that podcast. Live Like the World is Dying, another podcast on the Channel Zero network, has a lot of great information on a wide variety of topics. I've been a guest on there a couple times now, and it's one that I do listen to on a regular basis and recommend. And then finally, the Cultivariable podcast, which has very few episodes, but they're very interesting and is a lot about plant breeding. So still worth checking out, even if there's just a few. I'm a big fan of having reference books, if possible. If you don't have money to buy books or room to store them, a lot of times you can find PDFs of these, and that's nearly as good. Sometimes better because they're more searchable. But I personally love a nice paper book if I can get it. But just having that on the shelf as like a reference that's really well vetted, you don't have to like search out several different resources on the internet and try and figure out which one makes the most sense to believe, or synthesize information from multiple sources. Often, if you've got a good reference, you can just kind of take it at face value and see how it goes. Probably the reference book I use the very most is the Reference Manual of Woody Plant Propagation by Dirr and Heuser. It's pretty cheap, especially if you get like one edition old. Like I think there's a third edition. I have the second edition, and it's perfectly good. And that would be if you want sort of specifics of how to propagate different woody plants. Super useful. If you want more basic information on plant propagation, Secrets of Plant Propagation by Lewis Hill is a really good option for that. The Holistic Orchard by Michael Phillips is a great reference for fruit growing. And I always tell people that I recommend it with the caveat that the schedule of spraying and maintenance and stuff that's described in this book is like way beyond what most people can handle. So there's a lot of great information in there, but unless you are like devoting your entire life to growing top quality fruit, you probably can't do all the things. But it's also nice to have options of different things that you can do. Michael Phillips, who was a guest on this podcast years ago, I like his sort of take of like, well, let's try and prevent problems with good nutrition and probiotics and, working with beneficial insects and all this stuff. But if shit goes wrong, here's like some chemicals that are like not the worst that you could resort to if you really need it. So I think that's a pretty good take on orcharding. Not the only one, but useful information for sure in that book. Cornucopia II, a source book of edible plants, is really expensive to buy these days. I got lucky and got it from J.L. Hudson before it went out of stock there for like $30 or something. But now it's really expensive and hard to find. But if you can find a decent copy or a PDF, it's a pretty cool, just like tome of thousands and thousands of species with just a tiny bit of information about how they've been used as food throughout the centuries of humans. Edible Forest Gardens by Dave Jacke and Eric Toesmeier has a lot of theory and then also a lot of just like tables of plant species and a lot of really interesting information, and is definitely a book that inspired me to get interested in perennial agriculture and was one of the sort of earlier major works on temperate permaculture. So there's definitely some stuff that's out of date. I'm pretty sure I've heard one of the authors say that the information on dynamic accumulator plants didn't end up holding up to like kind of scientific review, and he regrets like jumping the gun on that. But you know, take that with an extra grain of salt. But there's still lots of good information in there, I think. If you want a mushroom book, Radical Mycology by Peter McCoy does a really nice job of being both like in-depth and accessible on a wide variety of topics. So that's a good one for that topic area. This one's super handy. The title is kind of horrendous. Tree Fruit Field Guide to Insect, Mite, and Disease Pests and Natural Enemies of Eastern North America. And it's got a bunch of authors, but it's published by Plant and Life Science Publishing. And this book is super helpful to identifying what is going wrong with fruit trees, especially some of the ones with higher pest and disease pressure, like apples, pears, stone fruit. Wouldn't necessarily follow the interventions that they recommend, but it's good to know kind of what the mainstream way to treat these pests is, and you can't really do anything about pests for the most part until you can identify what they are. So it's a great adjunct book to the Holistic Orchard. So if I've got a fruit tree problem that I'm not familiar with, I might try to identify it with the field guide, and then my next step might be look at the Holistic Orchard and see what Michael Phillips recommends for that issue. The Encyclopedia of Country Living by Carla Emery was originally published as a gigantic zine and is just a kind of massive compendium of how-to. Not everything in there I agree with, but it is kind of cool to have this really general reference guide to almost anything you might want to do, especially in the area of like sort of homestead arts and science. Definitely used it many times when it was just handy to have a paper reference for something. And I think it's pretty darn cheap, and there's like about 1 million editions of it. Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth is a nice, pretty brief reference guide for growing mostly vegetable seeds, but has a lot of handy information in there if that's something you're interested in. And then also Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties by Carrol Deppe, if you want to get into like vegetable and kind of general plant breeding. There's a lot of excellent information in there. Moving on from books to online resources, one really handy one is BONAP, which shows you range maps for plants all over North America. Very handy for telling if a species that you're considering working with is native to your area or where it's native to, or if it's listed as invasive in various areas. That's pretty useful. Plants for a Future, or PFAF, is a massive, massive list of edible and useful plants. The ratings of this plant is an excellent edible or this is marginally edible are pretty subjective, so I wouldn't weight that information too heavily. And often the propagation information is really general, so it's not super useful all the time for that. But as a first step of is this plant edible? It's great for that. And you can, once you've determined a little bit about the plant, you can hunt down sort of more specific or detailed information as needed. The Woody Plant Seed Manual is published by the U.S. Forest Service and has a lot of great information, both in general for growing woody plants from seed, and also specific for many, many species in there. And that's free online, at least for now, or until the Trump administration manages to purge every remotely useful aspect of the government. And then you've got Google. There is so much information on the internet that it can be kind of hard to find the good information, which is why I generally prefer books if I can get it, because that information tends to be much more vetted and higher quality, and the sort of overall quality of information on the internet seems to be going off a cliff right now. But there are still some tricks that you can use to try and find good plant information using Google. The first one is using the Latin name of the plant. That tends to bring up more sort of scholarly academic articles, which usually are better quality information than the common name, which tends to bring up more sort of anecdotal hearsay or just trash information. Doesn't always work, but I would start by Googling the Latin name and then adding search terms. Using more technical language can also help. So if you're looking for, how to start sea kale seeds or how to start sea kale from seed, you might Google Cramby maritima germination rather than sprouting sea kale seeds. Doesn't always work, but using words like germination, propagation, stratification to find that kind of information tends to bring up somewhat better quality information than less technical terms. That's all I've got for today. Hopefully you find those resources helpful, and if there's some resource that I didn't mention that you think would be really great to spread around, please send me an email and maybe I'll include it in a future episode. Unfortunately, for this episode, I didn't really have a question to answer for the question and answers segment. So if you've got questions you'd like to hear in this part of the episode, please do send them in, especially if you can record a voicemail and email that to me at propagandabytheseed@riseup.net. But what I did get was a question that I can't answer. And this question comes from Jimmy Ricard and goes like this. So where I live in so-called Australia, the weather can reach above 45 centigrade / 113 Fahrenheit and not rain at all for months at a time. Because of this, I use enclosed lidded compost bins for several hundred liters with no ventilation holes, as otherwise the compost material will quickly dry out and stop composting. I achieve oxygenation by regularly turning. I would like to know how others around the world adapt their composting methods to the extremes of the ever-changing local climatic conditions. So I only really know about my region for the most part. I can't really answer this question, but if you have an answer about how you manage compost in the ever-changing local climatic conditions, I'd love to hear about it and can air your answers in the next Q&A segment on Propaganda by the Seed shorts. Again, just record a voice memo and email it to propagandabytheseed@riseup.net. And we'll see if this sort of forum type question can work on this podcast.